Welcome back to the Kaiser Report. I'm Max Kaiser. Time now to go to Niceville, Florida, talk with Carl Denninger of market-ticker.org. Due to popular demand, we've invited Carl back on to finish where our last conversation ended, which was on the topic of libertarianism. Carl Denninger, welcome back to the Kaiser Report.
Thank you, Max.
Okay, now, you wrote on your blog recently, Carl, the unmourned victims of our bankster politics. So let's start with your thoughts, for example, on offshoring. Tell us about why this so-called free trade is not, in fact, genuine libertarian policy.
Problem with offshoring as it is practiced today is that it is not, as is often asserted, a function of a free market system. In other words, we are not talking about a corporation that chooses to take its labor offshore because the people there are smarter, are willing to work harder, and therefore produce a superior product at a better price. If that was the case, that would be capitalism, but that's not what's going on. Instead, we have companies that offshore their labor because they can enlist their governments in what amounts to coercion. So we have, for example, cases where people's agrarian way of life is literally destroyed by their totalitarian government coming in and bulldozing their fields, paving over their areas, and then saying, oh, by the way, here's a nice, bright new factory that you can go work in, and the alternative, if you don't want to do that, is that you starve. The other problem that you have within this so-called offshoring movement is that so much of what is going on, especially in the high-tech area where you're building integrated circuits and things like this, is that these processes inherently are fairly disruptive to the environment. The products that are put together in the high-tech area use a lot of very noxious chemicals, and it's expensive to dispose of those properly. But if you go over to China and some of these other third-world countries, their government doesn't really care. And so what ends up happening is that instead of paying the cost to properly dispose of the byproducts of these manufacturing processes, these companies simply throw this stuff away and poison the land, air, and water. And, of course, what goes along with that is the people. This, too, is not capitalism, and it is not libertarian thought either, because the premise of libertarianism is that you may do whatever you like as long as you don't harm anybody else. So there's a little bit of a disconnect here between the concept of being a libertarian and the concept of free trade, where the harm just happens somewhere where it's out of your vision. It is my assertion that if you inflict harm on another person, whether it happens here in the United States or whether it happens in some forlorn place in China, the fact of the matter is that coercion is coercion. And if I'm poisoning the land, air, and water, then I'm not engaged in something that could be considered libertarian.
All right, now, Carl, as you describe it, libertarianism, you've got, as defined, let's say, in the U.S. with the Constitution as the arbiter of legal boundaries. You've got a group of folks that are pursuing profits in the capitalist system and the distribution of resources vis-a-vis the market, vis-a-vis capitalism, is preferable over, let's say, the government getting into the business of distribution. What happens, though, when somebody does an offshoring campaign, a company is offshoring, or they are involved in massive pollution, as you've described it, they'll typically come back and say, well, that's what the market is. That's the market. The market becomes this catch-all phrase where it justifies everything. Mr. Market kind of justifies this behavior. There seems to be no discussion about what makes a market really. It just falls into something called the market. So how do you differentiate between, let's say, an actual market of that supports a libertarian view as you're describing it, versus just a catch-all phrase that seems to, where a lot of junk seems to go and is just incorporated in this concept? If that question kind of, I hope it makes sense. Your thoughts?
Yeah, it does, Max. The Libertarian Party, if you actually look at the governing documents and the foundation of principle behind it, the Libertarian Party likes to call itself the party of principle. And the founding principle behind the Libertarian Party is what's called the non-aggression principle. And what that principle states, and by the way, it's the only political party that requires that you take an oath to join. You are required to swear or affirm that you do not believe in the initiation of force to obtain political or social goals. Well, initiation of force is pretty clear. If I hold you down and beat you with a stick, I've obviously initiated force. If I pollute the land and water that you live upon without your permission, and nobody in their right mind would grant that, of course, then I have initiated force. So where the libertarians that are running for office seem to have some problems, and the party seems to have some problems in general with some of its policies, is that it talks a really nice game about being the party of principle, but when you get down to it, the difficulty is that you have to apply this principle evenly, otherwise you're just talking out both sides of your mouth. So what I assert is that if you're going to claim to be a libertarian, you're going to run as a libertarian, you're going to be a libertarian, then you have to take the position that initiation of force is wrong. And that means that if the purpose of your offshoring is to avail yourself of effectively slave labor, or a place to manufacture your products where you can poison the air, land, and water without recompense, then you're not a libertarian at all. You're a jackbooted statist. You're just trying to find somewhere where nobody sees what you're doing. You know, it's an interesting concept that people will raise that, well, this raises the standard of living for the people that are doing, the labor because they were gathering rice and rice paddies before this shiny new factory showed up. And my retort to that is that you could also make the argument that the slaves that were brought over from Africa were living in straw huts, and after they were brought to America, they were living in houses. Now, they may not have been, their labor was coerced and forced, but nonetheless, you could make the argument that, hey, look, that's a real roof. It's got, that house has walls. It's not made out of straw. The fact that somebody has gotten a better standard of living in some measurable way, however, does not change the fact that they didn't choose the set of circumstances under which they currently labor. And so, as libertarians, I believe we have to look at this from a different point of view, which is that the Constitution provides the United States with the means to redress this. That's tariffs. We don't want to talk about that because we say, well, that's the government interfering in this. But the fact of the matter is that if government has a right to exist at all, there's a purpose behind it. It is to arbitrate disputes and to take redressive action when somebody is aggressed upon. So if I rob you, the reason that we have a government is so that somebody can come along and say, hey, guess what? You robbed this person, you have to go to jail.
Right. So what you're describing there is you're saying this current crop of so-called libertarians, they fail to account for these externalities in terms of the pollution that they're generating. They're mischaracterizing the true motives behind offshoring. And now let's look at the financial industry and your thought about coercion and use of force as it relates to the financial industry, because most people equate the financial industry as being, quote, victimless, that it's just paper moving around, there's no crimes attached to it, there would be no coercion attached to it. Your thoughts, Carl?
Oh, it's absolute nonsense, Max. The fact of the matter is, look at the LIBOR scandal, for example. There have been people that have said, well, for every winner there was a loser. If you got overcharged, somebody else got loaned money at a lower rate. And I will simply observe that I can make the same argument for auto theft. If I steal your car, there are still the same number of cars that exist in the world. I may have it and you no longer do. This doesn't change the fact that what I did was coercive. You didn't consent to me taking your vehicle. So there's very little argument to be made here, I believe, within the libertarian perspective, that fraud, which is the intentional misrepresentation of something for your benefit and somebody else's detriment, does not fall within the mandate that says that you must not aggress against others.
All right, so we've got this dynamic set up here between, libertarianism, they tend to focus on government versus markets. Now let's look at the government side of things. Of course, that would include regulation. Government does regulation. So there was a move to get rid of Glass-Steagall, of course, under Sandy Weil at Citibank as part of this move to deregulate. Then we had Brooksley Born reported refusing to regulate fraud in the derivatives market. She had that incident with Alan Greenspan and Robert Rubin. And so there's been, under the so-called libertarian flag, a move to deregulate because of their interpretation of the government that is being interfering. What are your thoughts?
Well, again, I would argue that that is pure nonsense, and that you've got some people that are trying to use the libertarian banner as a cover for yet more theft, this time by the financial industry. The fact of the matter is that the creation of unbacked credit within the financial system, that is the giving of credit with no collateral behind it, is nothing other than counterfeiting. And if you look at it from a mathematical perspective, that's exactly what you have. If you have 10,000 units of production and 10,000 units of credit and currency, then 1 unit of one buys 1 unit of the other. If you can magically make another 10,000 units of credit and currency appear, then you have stolen value from all of the people who currently held credit and currency, because now 1 unit of production requires 2 units of credit or currency to buy it. So if we're going to claim that we're libertarians, then we have to take the position that the regulation that we are speaking of here that needs to be enforced is that thou must not counterfeit. Because if it is something that we should prohibit, that I cannot run off $100 bills on my office copier, I don't see why it's any different if the banking industry turns around and issues a bunch of unbacked credit that has the exact same impact in the markets as if I ran off those $100 bills.
All right, so taking what we've just said, let's look at a current example. You've got Mitt Romney. He's the Republican nominee for president. His business model over at Bain Capital, essentially leveraged buyouts, private equity, loading companies up with debt, extracting equity, going on as part of that whole financialization of the economy on Wall Street. What has he built wealth, and is he a libertarian?
Well, he's definitely not a libertarian. I don't begrudge anybody who takes their own capital or other capital from people and turns around and uses that as a means to acquire businesses that are in trouble, fix them, and then sell them back into the market. And once you fix them, if you've done a good job, they have a greater value than they had before, and therefore you make a profit. That's capitalism. There's nothing wrong with it. There is something, however, very wrong with using leveraged buyouts where the credit that's created came out of nothing, comes from thin air. Because then what you're doing is you're using the counterfeiting of the banking system to extract a piece of the value that is within that company. And whether you grew the value within the company in the process is not material. It's where did you get the so-called capital? Did the capital actually exist, or did you just invent it with the help of the banksters? And what we've seen all too often is that the latter is the case, that we have, and in many cases we have not only that, we have that coupled with the offshoring at the same time, where these companies are taken over, the labor is offshored for the explicit purpose of getting access to essential slavery and evasion of environmental regulations. And so that's where the so-called value add comes from, is that we take what were strictures on the pollution of air, land, and water and say, oh, well, you know, we can take $10 million a year out of the production cost of this facility if we're allowed to pollute. But we can't do that in the United States, so we'll put the plant in China. I don't see that as capitalism or libertarianism at all.
Fair enough. All right, Carl Denninger, we're out of time. Thanks for being on the Kaiser Report.
Thank you.
All right, and that's going to do it for this edition of the Kaiser Report with me, Max Kaiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank my guest, Carl Denninger of market-ticker.org. If you want to send me an email, please do so at kaiserreport@rttv.ru. Till next time, Max Kaiser saying bye, y'all.